Hi, welcome to session one of the topic titled The Socioeconomic Transformations of the Late 19th Century in the US. Now, we're initiating a new topic that is going to follow up on the issues and ideas we have been dealing with in the past in terms of looking at the late 19th century. Okay, this is a very critical period of time in U.S. history in which the United States is going to modernize, enter the modern age. We're going to see the rise of a modern society with a modern economy in the United States that really transformed the lives of Americans in terms of how people actually live, the setting in which most Americans are going to live in, and the kind of economic activities that they're going to now participate in. Okay, all of that is going to radically change in the latter decades of the 19th century as the country was modernizing, in other words. Okay, all of the traditional ways of life that Americans were accustomed to, like living in the countryside or in small agrarian communities, in small towns, where in the vast majority of Americans, when you look, for example, prior to this time, when you look back in time, not only decades but even a few hundred years into the past, the vast majority of Americans actually were farmers. Okay, they were working the land, growing their own crops, sustaining their own families. Again, it was mostly farming, if you will, society. Okay, in the past, that was really the traditional setting in the United States. Even going back to the colonial period, by the way. So all of that setting, this farming, lifestyle and farming traditions and so on, and this agricultural setting is rapidly going to change as we approach the late 19th century. Because the United States is going to be industrializing, on such a massive scale that the lives of Americans are going to change along with it in terms of millions of Americans, a great number of Americans are going to leave the life of the farm and the countryside and those small farming communities, and they're going to be moving now to a whole new setting, as we'll see, and that is, of course, the industrial city. Again, so most Americans by the end of the 19th century are going to be city dwellers, that is to say, living in cities, working for industries and a number of different enterprises and so on. Again, so there's going to be a radical change, a radical shift in the way Americans are going to live and the kind of economic activities that are going to sustain the lives of most Americans in the United States. Most Americans, as we'll see, are going to now work for factories, industries, and different kinds of enterprises, companies, and all that, earning wages, earning salaries, and this is how, again, we're going to see the rise, again, of a whole new economy, a whole new society and a whole new economy that together is simply called modernity, in other words. Okay. Now, going back to our slide here, we can capture now. Again, this is the title: "The Socioeconomic Transformations of the Late 19th Century in the U.S." So, as the title suggests, we're going to now look at a more material analysis of U.S. history in the late 19th century. That is going to now pay attention to the material conditions, the social and economic conditions of Americans in this time, and in terms of how those conditions were radically changing from the way people were accustomed in the past, as I mentioned, were more agricultural, to now a more industrial, conditions. Okay. So it's a material analysis now. The previous topic that we looked at, again, it was more ideological. We looked at ideas, like the idea of progress in terms of science, technology, in terms of capitalism, evolution, and all of that. It was critical to do that kind of analysis, the history of ideas, if you will, just to understand the mindset of Americans living during this time as they were modernizing. They interpreted all of the changes taking place around them as simply as a sign of progress. But in this topic, we're now going to pay attention to more tangible, physical, material, again, conditions, realities, if you will, that Americans were actually experiencing more directly on a day-to-day basis, how the lives of Americans were actually changing and how those conditions, alter the way people actually live and work, okay, in the physical, material world, okay. So what we're going to be doing here, okay, the way we're going to actually look at the socioeconomic transformations of the late 19th century in the U.S. is by looking at those social and economic transformations in different regions of the United States. Because as the United States was modernizing, okay, and is rapidly changing, it was really moving towards a more industrial order. Not, everybody in the U.S., okay, was experiencing this transformation at the same rate, at the same speed. It all depended, where you actually lived, okay? It's true, the entire country was changing, it was transforming, but different regions were moving faster than others. Let us just say that, okay? And that's exactly what we're going to be doing here, okay? We're going to see the modernization of three regions that were perhaps the most significant of this time. And that is the modernization. This is something we're going to do first, and the table of contents is telling you. We're going to look at the modernization first and foremost of the North, okay? So what is the North? Well, what we mean about the North in the late 19th century was this block of countries that constituted, for example, the Northeast, the northeastern states, along with the Midwestern state, the Midwest, that is to say. Okay, you can pretty much see here, again, in this map, this is what it was called the North. This is the region that in the Civil War was simply referred as the Union. Okay, this is the block of countries that fought the South. Again, this is called the Union, that is to say, that wanted to see the end of slavery and all of that, of course. And this is the very first region that industrialized, okay, in the United States very early on. So the first industrial revolution in the U.S. occurred first in this region, called simply the North, in other words. So what we're going to do is look at the socioeconomic transformations, first and foremost, in part one, in the North, that were taking place in the North part of the country. And as the table of contents indicates, what we're going to do here is look at the rise of a new social setting where most people living in this region are going to now move into. They're going to create something new that the vast majority, 70 to 80% of people in the North, are simply now, by the turn of the century, by the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, the vast majority, again, of Americans living in the North are going to now living in a new social setting called simply the modern industrial city. The large industrial cities, again, they're going to prop up, across those states in the North. And this is going to be something new, something totally new. It's a new experience, in U.S. history where most people are going to now live. In other words, they're now going to move by the millions, again, to those urban centers where there were, of course, a series of industries, factories, industrial plants, and so on. And most people in the North are going to actually relocate there and live there permanently, that is to say. There's going to be gigantic cities now. Of course, this is something that we're going to see here. okay, in part one. So this is, again, one region that we're going to see those changes there. Okay, and then part two is going to move to see the transformations of another region, and that is the South. Okay, so what we mean about the South is really the region that comprise all of the states that were the slaveholding states prior to the Civil War, and that seceded from the Union in 1860 to create what is called the Confederacy. Okay, this is the region that fought in the Civil War. The North. That is to say, those are actually those two blocks that actually fought each other during the Civil War. But with the ultimate defeat of those southern states, when slavery was abolished, and there were millions of slaves that were liberated after the Civil War. What we're going to see is the emergence of a new South, okay, a totally reformed, totally new South that is attempting to catch up with the changes that were transpiring in the North in terms of industrializing, trying to develop factories, industries, enterprises, railroads, trying to modernize. But it's going to do so at a much slower pace than what the North was actually going through. And the reason for that is because the North was already, way into this process for many, many decades, ever since the 1820s. Okay, when the North was industrializing, the first industrial revolution took place in the North starting in the 1820s. So the North was way ahead, again, in this process of change, in this process of modernization. And the South is going to attempt to catch up, with the North. And it's going to do that, again, at a much slower pace, if you will, okay? But nonetheless, is really, again, really recreating a whole new society, a whole new economy that we're going to see, as we'll see again in part two, really the creation of a whole new South. And this is exactly what we're going to do here in part two. How exactly the South was changing, how the lives of millions of Southerners, were changing with the coming of industries, etc. All of that will be assessed here, okay, in great detail. And of course, the third part three, is going to look at another region, and this is another very important region. Again, is called the West. It was actually referred to back in the 19th century as the Wild West, because even at the time of the Civil War, from 1860 to 65, this region was still unsettled. Americans had not yet moved there, let us just say, to organize territories or start really moving those territories into states. There was still this large area, for the most part, was occupied by millions of Native Americans who depended on the hunting of the buffalo. There were over 13 million buffaloes roaming around this region, from north to south and south to north, according to the seasons. And those Native American groups were, traditionally, again, those were hunters and gatherers. That were people that survived from the hunting of the buffalo, that is to say. So this region had not yet really developed at all. But after the Civil War in Reconstruction process, after Civil War and Reconstruction, Americans are going to be moving there by the millions again into this region to settle, to occupy, to develop the land, and to move to develop different kinds of enterprises again that transform the landscape, transform this region, into what eventually it became, in the 20th century, all the way to the present day, fully developed, fully transformed, civilized, if you will, region. We're going to see the new American West, in other words, in part three. Again, so we're looking at social and economic change as the country was modernizing, but the way we're going to actually look at this topic, as I said, is by looking at, at regional analysis. The North the South, and the West. And this is going to actually enable us to understand how the country was changing, according to the region, that is to say. Okay, so let's start, therefore, with part one. That is going to look at the North. Okay, this region I just show you again in this map. That in the late 19th century is going to change so dramatically that we're going to see something totally new arising in the North, and that is the new American industrial city. This is going to be the fundamental social setting where Americans are going to, for the most part, the vast majority, again, of Americans living in the North are going to now live in. Okay, more Americans are moving to cities. They're now going to experience their lives, again, their existence inside of their cities. They're going to create their cultures inside of their cities. They're going to build social networks, social bonds in those cities, and this is going to be the universe, in other words, okay, that people are going to be so familiar with now from now on. Again, this is how American society and the American economy in the North is going to look like as it's entering the modern age. Okay, is going to give birth again to something totally new. Again, the American industrial city, that is to say. Okay, so the way we're going to look at the North and the rise of this new city is by looking first and foremost at one of the most dramatic transformations that enabled the rise of this new setting called, again, the industrial city in the North. So why is it, in other words, that the North is going to change so dramatically that now we're going to see millions and millions of people living in cities? Is that in the late 19th century in the United States, the United States, more particular, the northern states, again, of this region, were experiencing what is now called in U.S. history the Second Industrial Revolution. Okay? The Second Industrial Revolution. What this means is that there was already a first industrial revolution that this region had gone through, okay, in the past. I mentioned, again, that in the United States, the Industrial Revolution arrived to the north part of the country back in the 1820s. From the 1820s, 30s, 1840s, 1850s, what we see is that the northern states were experiencing the first wave of industrialization in the United States. While the rest of the country was still pretty much following the old traditional setting of agriculture. Still farming and so on. Again, the rest of the country. But where you're going to see the rise of the first factories, the first industries, and so on, again, it was in the North. Again, that was the first industrial revolution. And for the most part, when we look at the first industrial revolution in the U.S., the manufacturing, the industrial processes, again, were all centered in the production of clothing. It was called textiles. Again, the first industrial revolution, it was about textiles, okay, fabrics, clothing of all kinds. This is what the first industrial revolution was all about. Weaving cotton, again, for the most part, it was actually, cotton fiber into finished clothing, many types of different attires and, items and so on. That was the first industrial product, so to speak, of the first industrial revolution in the U.S. Back during the first industrial revolution, factories were not that large. Okay, the largest factory, back in the industrial revolution, the first industrial revolution, housed about 400 workers, and that was considered to be a gigantic, massive operation. Okay, a factory of 400 workers. back in the 1840s, for example, in places like Rhode Island, for example, okay, or Massachusetts, in New England. But all of that is going to change during the second industrial revolution. In the second industrial revolution, we're going to see, for example, the rise of new industries. Okay, industries that were, for the most part, not even present in the past in the United States. So there's going to be new industries, and as we'll see, those industries are going to be far more gigantic in their scope of operations. That instead of just housing 400 workers, they're going to house thousands of workers at any given plant or factory. So again, the second industrial revolution was far more dramatic, again, in terms of the scope, the size, if you will, of those industries. There's going to be a multiplicity of different industries, but they're going to be gigantic, again, in size and scope. Okay, so in the second industrial revolution, we're going to see, for example, industries coming to the north that are going to provide, of course, hundreds of thousands of jobs, again, to Americans. And most Americans are going to be working for those industries, by the way. For example, the steel and railroad, industries. Again, for example, in places like Pittsburgh, we're going to see, of course, the steel industry there. Okay, there was an attempt to build railroads all over the country, again, to link the country together commercially. So the railroads were going everywhere after the Civil War. So in order to provide the resources, the materials for the railroads to develop all systems of transportation, thousands and thousands of miles of tracks, again, that needed to be built, and wagons and locomotives and engines and all of that, well, you need a steel industry. Okay, so we're going to see the steel industry along with a series of railroad companies, again, that are going to prop up, that are going to be headquartered, particularly in the north part of the country, the steel and the railroads, that is, okay, particularly the Pennsylvania Railroad, okay. And along with that, there's going to be yet other industries in the second industrial revolution that are going to be also intertwined with the steel and railroad companies as well. Because in order to manufacture steel, well, you need a certain raw material, and that is iron ore. You need iron ore to actually manufacture steel for the railroads. This is a mineral that comes from the earth, that is to say, has to be mined. So we're going to see mining, companies also developing in the north that were geared to explore, do mining explorations, and of course mining operations, the extraction of the iron ore. That was sent to the steel plants for the manufacturing, again, of railroads and other equipments as well. It was not just railroads. Steel was manufactured for building, things like bridges, for example, for building factories, for building, massive buildings as well, skyscrapers and all of that, of course. So we're going to see mining companies, okay, propping up as well in the north, but also mining companies that were also engaged in the extraction of coal. Coal was the fuel of the first and second industrial revolutions. So when we talk about the first industrial revolution and the second industrial revolution in the US, coal was the fuel that powered up railroads, or that was used to smelt iron ore in the manufacturing of steel. In the steel plants, again, people actually used coal to smelt, liquefy iron ore and build, of course, all sorts of materials, steel based materials. So it was essential to also develop coal mining companies as well. Again, this is also that we're going to see as well, okay, and the second industrial revolution. On top of that, those very essential industries, those are new, by the way, new industries, we're going to see additional ones arising after the Civil War that are a part of this wave of industrialization, okay, taking place in the country, and that is the oil industry. So besides the ones I just mentioned, there is also an oil industry on the rise. Again, it's a steady rise. Again, in the late 19th century, we're not going to see the type of, for example, massive giant oil companies that will come to exist in the 20th century. Because the 20th century, we're going to see, for example, new technologies like the automobile and the airplane that require now, of course, things like gasoline or diesel and so on, the oil derivatives, in other words. So we're going to see an oil boom, if you will, in the 20th century, and oil companies are going to now grow, in such a massive scale that they're going to acquire, greater and greater significance in the national economy. But, in the late 19th century, the oil companies, again, that were on the rise were important because oil was used to, for example, for oil lamps, even before the coming of electricity and the light bulb, how people actually illuminated their offices and homes and all is by, having oil lamps, for example. So that was one use that was very, very instrumental, in the late 19th century in terms of the uses of oil, for example. Okay, and also oil was used to create some form of chemicals that were used for in industries, lubricants, for example, for the railroads and the like. So again, this was an emergent, industry in the late 19th century. Oil, that is to say, it was part of the second industrial revolution. The other industries are going to be also energy centered. Okay, for example, electrical companies. The oil industry is an energy centered company, but there's, in addition to that, with the coming of electricity, and we got now motors powering up factories, for example, and the light bulb is going to be used to illuminate cities, buildings, offices, factories, and the like. We're going to see now the emergence of electrical companies that are going to generate electricity and sell it, for domestic and commercial use. Okay, and likewise, as we see cities powered up by electricity, this is going to be an emergent industry that also offered people, of course, jobs. There's now opportunities for people to actually work there and make a living. In other words, working in those electrical companies. At the same time, we're also going to see the rise of chemical industries as well. Okay, the second industrial revolution was also, a time when we see the rise of chemical companies. Okay, chemical companies that were manufacturing chemicals that, for the most part, had an industrial use. Almost exclusively when we talk about the late 19th century, that is to say, still, again, the chemical companies that were emerging during this time, for the most part, were just simply manufacturing the type of chemicals that the railroads or the steel plants and mining, for example, required. And those were, of course, companies that were providing, again, those resources, those products. Those were actually industrial products that people use for industrial production, that is to say. Okay, chemicals as well. It's a lot of chemical plants, chemical industries, chemical companies, propping up as well. And another industry in the late 19th century were pharmaceuticals. We have been talking about that in the past. How we're going to see the rise of pharmaceutical drugs, for example. And the late 19th century was a time for this emergent industry. Okay, when we're going to see the rise of pharmaceutical companies that were attempting to manufacture, for example, certain medicines or syrups, certain treatments that people will take in order to alleviate the symptoms of sickness or illness and so on and so forth. So we're not seeing yet, the rise of the type of pharmaceutical companies that are going to appear on the 20th century. Not yet there, but this is something that is arising, okay, in the late 19th century, in pharmaceutical companies. And last but not least, I should say that another very critical industry that occupied a central place in the lives of Northerners, particularly people who live in the Chicago area, okay, particularly, is the beef industry. Okay, the beef industry. The beef industry is going to be booming after the Civil War as a result of a new technology, okay, that might appear very simple to us, but this technology was simply the refrigerator rail car. Okay, it's a rail car, it's a wagon, in other words, and it's a railroad wagon that is refrigerated, that is to say. Okay, so with this invention, what changed is that now you can transport meat, beef, or other animal products across state lines because you can refrigerate them, you can preserve them, and you can find markets outside of the region from which those animals were raised. So again, this is going to now lead to what is called a beef boom in the United States, because more and more people are going to find now beef in their local supermarkets. Okay, something that was quite difficult in the past. In order to eat beef, you needed to really live near cattle ranch. That is to say, okay, that was the only way. Buy beef the same day when the cow was actually slaughtered. They were very difficult. It was very difficult to actually freeze. It was actually impossible because there was no refrigerator. So people had to eat everything fresh, for that matter, or preserve it in other ways, like rubbing salt. In other words, using salt or vinegar, trying to pretty much create what is called beef jerky, trying to preserve the beef. But the taste is not going to be the same, because once you cure the beef with salt, it's going to be very, very salty. This is unavoidable. That's the only way you could actually preserve beef for days or weeks at a time. But now you can actually just refrigerate it, freeze it, and then move it across state lines from where the cattle was actually raised. You can actually transport it now to slaughterhouses. We're going to see, of course, slaughterhouses in Chicago and meatpacking plants there in Chicago receiving cattle that was raised in different parts of the country, particularly in places like Texas, Kansas, or Colorado, where the cattle ranches were, and the cattle are going to be transported to Chicago, where the cattle is going to be slaughtered there in massive slaughterhouses. Again, there's industrial plants where people will slaughter the cattle and then package the meat, where the meat is going to be distributed across the states that consume all products. At this time, we're talking about that the consumer base of the United States is all pretty much centered on the eastern side of the United States. This is where most Americans actually live, in the, if you will, the eastern states, that is to say. Okay, not just the eastern seaboard, but all of people living in the eastern side of the country, because the West has not yet been developed, that is to say. So all the consumers, all the people that are actually consuming food products, beef, again, are in the east. So the beef is actually sent there. And as more and more Americans now see meat available in their local stores and supermarkets and meat markets, there's going to be now a growing demand for beef. That is going to accelerate, on one hand, the raising of cattle in those cattle ranches, again, in places like Texas, Kansas, and Colorado, but also is going to intensify the industrial production, the industrial activities of the slaughterhouses and the meat packaging plants of Chicago, that is to say. So Chicago was really the industrial center, again, of the beef industry. Let's just put it that way. Okay? And it's going to be massive, and gigantic in size and scope, the operations. And again, so the significance of all of those industries I just mentioned, from the steel, the railroad, the mining companies, for example, that I mentioned, the oil, the electrical companies, the chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and the like, the beef, is that those were, as I mentioned, massive operations. Okay, those were not mid-sized type of enterprises; those were gigantic. Okay, gigantic enterprises that housed, at the very least, about 800 workers. Let us just say that the smallest factory in the north had about 800 workers. That was double the size of the textile factories of the first industrial revolution, that housed about 400 workers. But now in the second industrial revolution, forget about that, because we're now talking about a bare minimum of 800 workers. And industrial plants could house all the way to 4,000, industrial workers. In other words, you're working in a factory, let's say in New York or in Pennsylvania, in Boston, Chicago, for example, that again is going to house thousands and thousands of workers there working with you. That is to say, in different sections, different departments, if you will. But nonetheless, again, this is something new. This is totally, totally new. More and more Americans in the North are going to now work for industries. Okay, so this is an industrial economy now, in which the vast majority, again, of Americans living in this region are going to earn their living. They're going to be earning wages and salaries by actually laboring, working for any of those industries I just mentioned, of course. Okay, so this is something new that is radically changing the way Americans actually work, because, as I mentioned, when you look, for example, at this region, let's say the North in 1800, let us just say 1800 as a reference point. This is again 20 years before the start of the first industrial revolution in the North. The vast majority of Americans living in the northern states were farmers. The vast majority of them, 80 to 90%, again, of Americans living in the North were actually farmers. They were, owning a small plot of land, and what they were doing is pretty much growing their own, food, growing crops, wheat, corn. They had some animals as well that they farmed, and pretty much that was a type of economic activity that sustained the lives of Americans and families and communities. Okay, but again, this is coming to an end. In only 100-year period, what we're going to see is, a radical transformation, taking place with the first and second industrial revolutions, the coming of factories, the coming of industries. More and more Americans are going to be living the life of the farm, and they're going to be migrating now, again, to those industrial centers in search for jobs. And we're now going to see, of course, a whole new reality, a whole new social setting where Northerners are going to live in now. So much so that by the end of the century, let us say by 1900, in only a 100-year period, 80%, 70 to 80% of Americans in the North have left the farm, have left those farming communities, the countryside, and they have relocated permanently now to a new place. And the vast majority of Americans in the North are city dwellers now. Now they live in a new setting called the modern industrial city. And this is something that is very, very important to look at here. When we look at the North, is that it's not just that there's a second industrial revolution taking place, but what's going to happen is that those industries that I just mentioned, all of those industries that were located in different northern cities, what they're going to do is that they're going to be like magnets for human populations. They attracted, in other words, people uh, that were still pretty much, living in the countryside, they're going to attract them by not only the thousands or hundreds of thousands, but by the millions to actually move to those centers in search for work. That is to say, in search for wages, in search for a new life, if you will, nearby those industrial centers. And as millions are flocking to those industrial centers, we're going to see the rise again of something new. And this is going to be called, again, the modern industrial city. That is to say, those were large, if not gigantic, urban centers that contain what is called multi-ethnic populations. Multi-ethnic populations. In other words, that the populations, as we'll see again in this discussion, were very diverse. There were a lot of ethnicities, that is to say, that there were people coming from many different ethnic backgrounds with their own cultures, their own customs and the like. And far from seeing those cities as pretty much composed of one or two ethnicities, again, they're going to become, again, pretty much places where you're going to find pretty much samples, representatives, again, from the different places of the world, that is to say. People that were coming, in other words, from all over the planet, so to speak, quote unquote. I mean, that's a metaphor, of course, but they're going to be so diverse, again, in how the populations are going to look like. So let us look then at the rise of the modern industrial city, how those cities came into being, how they were structured, how people lived, and what was the culture like. In other words, the people living now in this new city, in the new modern industrial city, that is going to be the primary social setting for millions of Northerners, living around this time. So let's look at now, again, just very quickly. All right, so we still have some time. So first and foremost, let's look at how those cities came into being. Okay, I just mentioned, of course, that the way those cities emerged is as a result of actually people pouring in, flocking to those industrial centers, where there were factories, industrial plants, and companies of all kinds offering, of course, jobs. And because there was a need for labor in those industries, we're going to see millions of Americans, particularly Northerners, really moving there. And this is how the cities actually came into being. So this is really critical, to look at, to understand. When we study human history, let's say world history, when we study world history, we see patterns, for example, okay? All over the world, the pattern is that the rise of cities, okay, ever since, for example, the rise of the very first cities in the ancient world, all the way to this time that we're talking about, the late 19th century, is that cities, the way those cities emerge in history is really, again, the byproduct of outer migrations. In other words, cities always arise in history anywhere in the planet as a result of actually people pouring into a specific region, a specific spot, where people find some form of economic boom. In other words, there are resources, there's a lot of food that people are producing, there's very good land, plenty of rivers that allow people to grow products on a massive scale. You name it. So whenever there is an economic boom that allows people to actually survive better because there's more opportunities, there's more probabilities for people to actually survive, they just simply flock there to that region. So this is the pattern that is repeated over and over again all over the planet, everywhere. Okay? So cities really don't grow as a result of people simply multiplying very, very fast and reproducing fast. In other words, it's not really the result of higher birth rates versus lower death rates. Okay, this is not how cities arise in history, but it's quite the contrary result of migrations, that is to say. Okay, and the same is true in the U.S. in this time when there's, of course, an economic boom. The economic boom is the second industrial revolution. There are industrial centers that are attracting human populations because people see an opportunity there to actually survive better. The higher probability for people to actually live better, than to have a permanent job, employment. They're going to have income, steady income every week or every month. And, people are pursuing cash payments. They want cash. So they're moving there, in other words, okay? Not that they rejected the life of the farm. They did not like it. They did, of course, like the life of the farmer, of course, farming and all that. It's true. But people want to improve, their standards of living. They want money, in other words. They want cash. So that is being offered, in those industries called wage labor, that is to say. So there's going to be now a phenomenon. When we look at the late 19th century, early 20th century, when there was massive industrialization taking place, let's say in the US, and also there's massive industrialization taking place in Europe, by the way. Europe was also going through its own industrial revolutions, a number of countries that were industrializing as well. So this produced a phenomenon in global history called global migrations. Okay. There is a massive movements of people around the world in which people were trying to relocate from their country of origin to move into one of those countries that were rapidly industrializing, whether they wanted to move to Germany or they wanted to move to the United States, etc., because there were massive industrialization taking place. It didn't matter. People were looking for jobs. People wanted an economic opportunity, in other words, to leave their country of origin that they felt, or they saw no opportunities there, and they just simply wanted to move again to those countries and search for jobs. This was a massive, again, phenomenon of the late 19th century, early 20th century, global migrations. There's millions of people moving across the planet as a result of the Industrial Revolution. There's also merchants that are interested in relocating to other places for, investing, in other countries. There are Europeans moving into Africa. There are Americans moving into places like Mexico, Central America. There are Europeans moving into Asia, places like China for investment, trying to invest in railroads and all that. So there's massive movements. There's a massive global migrations, and so those global migrations were instrumental in the making of the American industrial city. Okay, the massive movement of people. Number one, as I just mentioned, within the United States, there are millions of American farmers that are moving to those centers. Okay, so even within the United States, there's a lot of movement taking place. Okay, there's millions of American farmers that live their small type village towns, so to speak. They're, farming communities, and they're flocking to those large urban cities for the most part. Again, so that's something we can actually see. Within even the United States, there's movement, taking place. There's relocation, there's migrations, that is to say, taking place. At the same time, we're going to see also the movements, the migrations of a great number of African Americans that lived in the South that actually are moving up north. There's, of course, the news that there are a multiplicity of different companies and industries propping up across the north that experience shortages of labor. And so there's going to be a substantial number, about 10% of the African Americans that lived in the South. We're talking about 4 to 5 million, African Americans lived in the South at the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction. So 10% of that will be anywhere between 450 to 500,000, African Americans. Once again, from 450 to 500,000 African Americans that are going to move up north. Okay, they're going to be flocking to industrial centers in places like Boston and Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, for the most part, in search for jobs. In other words, they're leaving the South. They're leaving their place of origin. That is to say, so Southern African Americans moving up north were simply called during this time exodusters. Exodusters is a biblical term that actually refer to the Jews, the Hebrews, in other words, that left their place of origin. And it is an exodus, meaning that they left their place of origin in search for lands to settle and so on, and they were really moving away again from their own home place, that is to say. So African Americans felt the same way, that they were leaving their home place, their place of origin, the South, in search for economic opportunities up north as well, called the exodusters. Okay, and last but not least, when we talk about now, in this case, global migrations, the new American industrial city in the north were also composed of actually peoples coming into the United States from abroad, particularly from southeastern European countries. There are going to be a large influx of southeastern Europeans that are going to be moving into the United States, particularly between the years of 1870 all the way to 1920. We're talking about a 50-year period. In that 50-year period, there are going to be about 25 million, immigrants coming from places like Italy, Greece, Hungary, Poland, Germany. There were also, of course, a great number of Jews as well coming into the United States to settle in places like New York as well during this time. Okay, so there's also that component that we're going to see people coming from Europe into the United States in search for jobs, because despite the fact that there were millions of American farmers and there were hundreds of thousands of African Americans in the South moving up north in search for jobs, still that was not sufficient. That those industries were just so massive, okay, of the second industrial revolution, that there was always, again, this shortage of labor. Labor, was always very scarce, and so the United States had to pretty much open up its doors to European immigration. In this case, in order to compensate for that shortage, so those industries will have enough labor, that is to say. So it had to pretty much open the doors. In 50 years, 25 million, of course. Italians, Greeks, Hungarians, Poles, Germans, and Jews, of course, for the most part, that came to those cities. They settled there, and they're going to now, contribute to the formation of this new setting, if you will, this gigantic, large urban centers with a very diverse ethnic, population makeup. Okay, so again, there's a multiplicity of different groups that form the American city in the North, and those cities were now, so different from the cities of the past, in that now there's going to be at least 1 million residents living in each of those cities. Whereas in the past, when you look back in time, let's say at the time of the Civil War, let's say 1860, the largest city in the United States was about 400, perhaps 450,000, people. Let's say New York, for example, 400,000. But now they're reaching 1 million and over by the end of the century, by 1900. There's now going to be millions, again, of people living there. So something has changed. There's something new on the rise. There's now a new social setting, if you will, that most Americans living in the North are trying to adapt to. They're trying to adapt to a whole new setting, a new way of life, and this is a new reality. This is so different from anything that they have experienced in the past. Now, this is a whole new reality. They're sharing space now with millions of people, most of whom they don't even know. Okay, because if you're coming from a small town, let's say if you're an American farmer, if you're coming from a small farming community, you knew everybody back home. You knew everybody by name, their last name. Everybody knew each other, and so on. It's a very familiar setting. Everybody pretty much, identifies the families, the people that are there. And every time there's somebody coming from outside, everybody understands who is the outsider and all of that. And likewise, there's going to be people coming from Europe, from places like Poland or Germany, that are also arriving to a whole new reality. It's not just a new country. Yeah, they're arriving to a new country, the United States, but they're arriving to cities that are just gigantic, and that the people that live there again are totally different in culturally, ethnically, you name it, in every possible way from you. So this required a process of what is called adaptation and assimilation. People had to adapt to this new social setting, and there's also this process of you have to assimilate, in other words, to the way of life, to the way people live inside of the city, in other words, particularly, immigrants. When we talk about, for example, European immigrants coming from the countries I just mentioned, for them, it was tougher, to come to the U.S. and trying to pretty much adapt to this new reality. You're living in a different country with different laws, different customs, different culture, different language, and you have to adapt and assimilate, in other words. That was challenging, for those European immigrants. And so let us look at this issue. Again, this is point number 2. This is something that is really going on inside of those cities. Again, European immigrants are trying to deal, with this new reality. They have to adapt and assimilate. So how are they doing this? And one of the strategies that immigrants use worldwide, by the way, in order to adapt and assimilate is by actually adapting and assimilating very gradually and very slowly, because you cannot just forget about your heritage, forget about your culture, okay, and moving to another country and pretty much, reframe your view of the world all entirely. Let us just say that you, after finishing school, you end up in a very good paying job, in Japan. You have to move there. The headquarters of the corporation is in Japan. You're going to work there, and that's going to be your country now. So you have to adapt and assimilate to Japanese culture. It doesn't mean that you're going to embrace everything, but you have to kind of just grow accustomed to live in another country, because that's where your job is, in other words. That's the same principle for, all immigrants of any society and any culture. Again, immigrants that are coming from one place and moving to another. Again, there's this very slow process of adaptation and assimilation that always takes place. And the way people actually cope with this type of change is by preserving as much as possible your own heritage, your own traditions. Okay? So the first generation of immigrants, perhaps the second generation of immigrants, what happens is that as you move to another country, you're trying to preserve your sanity. In other words, look, I really, want to adapt and assimilate, but I want to do this slow, very, very slow. Perhaps my children or grandchildren are going to be the ones that are going to fully assimilate. So first generation, second generation of immigrants, always what happens is that they cope with this change by preserving traditions. I'm going to preserve my language. I'm going to preserve my religion. I'm going to preserve my food culture. And by preserving those traditions, those customs, and so on, I can find myself. I know who I am inside of this, gigantic what they call, for example, this gigantic jungle, in other words, that we call simply the city, that seems to be very chaotic, is full of strangers. But one way I can actually preserve, myself, my own identity, is by preserving, the traditions of the culture where I come from, my heritage, that is to say, and perhaps even live and mingle and socialize with people that come from, the same country of origin as well. I'm going to actually hang out with, for example, if you come from Italy, you might say, I want to hang out with other Italians, in other words, and maybe preserve our religion, Catholicism, build a Catholic church where we're going to actually go there and remember who we are in that space and call the church, or, during Sundays and so on. Or we're going to open up a restaurant, an Italian restaurant to open up, to offer foods, again, to other Italians so they can eat there and remember, whole. We're going to actually offer traditional dishes and so on, so we can all remember that we all come from Italy. So we can make sense again of this, of this world that we live in here in the city and so on. We speak Italian there and so on. Again, I'm just giving you an example. Again, the same holds true for Greeks, for Jews, for Germans, for Poles, Hungarians, and the like. They're trying to preserve their traditions so they can cope with this radical, dramatic change that they're experiencing. They're in a different country with a whole different culture. In other words, another kind of survival type of strategy that European immigrants employed during this time to adapt and assimilate was by actually looking for protection. Okay, looking for protection. So the way it worked back in those European countries, is that when you look at, for example, Germany, Italy, Poland, and all those countries, Greece, is that the way people actually survive is by rendering their services to the local city boss. Okay, in other words, back in Europe, there's always some form of political boss or city boss. He's the strong man, of the city that offers protection, okay, to the people living in the town or city and so on. He's the strong man. He's not necessarily a political official. He's not necessarily, in other words, the mayor, but he's the one that pretty much controls city politics, in other words, okay? And so if you render your service to that city boss, if you're always loyal to that city boss, you're going to be well off, because that city boss or that strong man is going to protect you, is going to ensure that you're going to have some form of employment and so on and so forth. That's the way it worked back in Europe. And so as those immigrants arrive to the United States, they're going to find out that the American city operated in a very similar fashion. It was not very different. In other words, that also inside of the cities, there were always like a political boss, that is to say. The political boss was the strong man of the city, that he was actually in charge of what is called a political machine. The political machine is really the political party that ruled the city, in other words. So in the North, for the most part, we're talking about the Republican Party. The Republican Party rules the North. So when we're talking about political bosses, those are actually people inside of the Republican Party that controls an entire organization inside of the city of the Republican Party that ensures the continuity of the party in office. Election after election after election again. So what many of those immigrants were actually doing is that they were now reaching out to the political boss of the city, whether it's New York or Chicago, etc. And they were simply rendering their services to them, saying, look, whatever you need. I work in this industry, but I just want to let you know that if you ever need assistance or help in any regard, I'm going to actually, you can call me, in other words. I can actually provide a service to you. And, the idea is that the political boss in return will take care, of that immigrant in terms of ensuring that that individual is going to be employed. that is going to find you a job. The political boss is going to make sure that you're always going to have a job. He's going to make some calls or whatever, talk to some people to ensure that you're going to be always employed, in other words. So that's another survival strategy that those immigrants were pretty much, again, working for political bosses. And the political bosses, in many cases, were trying to help those immigrants assimilate to American culture by actually paying for English classes, in other words. Like after work, why don't you go to this location? There's going to be an English teacher, and take some English classes there. You have to learn some English, for example. If you're Italian or if you're German, etc., you have to learn English. So the political boss was also engaged in trying to transform those European immigrants into Americans. You have to become an American. So I'm going to actually help you, not only protect you because you're rendering service to me, but I'm also going to help you become an American as well. Like, for example, teach you some English and so on. Okay. So, those were, pretty much strategies, survival strategies, preserving traditions or joining political machines and so on, that those immigrants were, using in order to survive better, again, in this new American city. Number 3, another important aspect of the new American industrial city in the north is the living and working conditions, okay, of the people that were, dwelling there now. Of course, how the city actually looked like, where people actually live, or how their living conditions like, and so on and so forth. So when we go back in time, if we land in any of the major industrial cities of the north in the late 19th century, what we'll find is that there was certain patterns, if you will, all over those cities that were very recognizable. In terms of the layout, again, how the city was actually laid out. For example, it was very well known that what we called the center part of the city, okay, we call it downtown now, okay, this was actually the most heavily industrialized part of the cities. In other words, where those factories, manufacturing plants, and those companies were actually headquartered and located, were in downtown. Downtown was where the industry was raging, in other words. Okay? And so most people actually worked there, by default, when you're talking about that the people living in the cities work for those industries, is that they have to rush to work by actually going to downtown, work there, and this is the place of work. So this is a very noisy place. It's full of traffic. You'll see, thousands of people, rushing to work in the morning and out of work in the evening and so on. This is very typical. So therefore, what we're going to see is that all of the surrounding areas, of what is called downtown, were actually the place where the industrial working class actually is going to live. Okay, because they couldn't afford, paying for metro rail, for that type of transportation. So they have to live very nearby their jobs. Okay, about a mile, in other words, they live very near. They walk to their job by walking a mile, every day, in and out. So, this is the region of the city that is going to be the region known as the ghettos, in other words. Okay, so back during this time, the ghetto was simply a working class slum, in other words. Okay, very different from how we use that word today. Okay, it's totally different. by the way. Now, when we call ghetto back then, it was simply where the working class lived. Overcrowded in many cases, poor material conditions. There was a lack of services in many cases. Houses were overcrowded with, let's say, immigrants. There's 10, 15 people living in a single place and so on. So again, this is the kind of the poor side of town, that is to say. Once again, it's very noisy, very polluted because there's a lot of smoke and chemicals. There's traffic, noise, and all of that. Okay, it's called the ghetto, in other words. So this is very typical, again, of the modern industrial city, back during this time. Another important feature of the new industrial city, of course, was the presence of what I just referred to a moment ago of ethnic communities. In other words, that immigrants congregated based on their country of origin. They congregated together and lived in specific regions of the city. There was always the side of town where you find the Greeks, the side of town where you find, for example, the Jewish population, the Germans, and so on. So it was all subdivided in that way as well. Okay, there's also the presence of what is called ethnic communities. And last but not least, another very important feature of the American industrial city in the north is now the growing presence of what is called the suburbs. So the middle class, the professionals, the managers, the engineers, the professional managerial class, that is to say, that worked in downtown throughout the day, they escaped, pretty much the noise, the pollution, the ghettos, the slums, if you will, the working class slums, by actually moving outside, to really moving into the outskirts of the cities, that is to say. And they created their own middle class communities as well. Okay, this is the professional managerial class, the professionals, the managers, and so on, that work in those industries and earn higher wages. So what they did is that they simply just moved outside, in other words, and created what's called a suburb. Again, they're not living inside of the city per se, they're pretty much outside, okay? And they're creating their middle class, subdivisions, middle class communities, that they have their own stores, in many cases, their shopping malls and the like. And so all they were required really, was to go to work during the week, every day. But during the weekend, they're going to be outside of the city, pretty much living in their own separate space, if you will. This is called the suburb. This is another feature, of the new industrial city. Okay, so number 4. Okay, so what was the culture like of the city? Okay, because we have talked about particularly the social, pretty much makeup, the social conditions, how the cities were created by migrations, what kind of groups moved there, how they, what kind of strategies they used to adapt and assimilate, what was the layout, the living conditions, again, of the people of the city. Now, what we have to talk about now here is the culture. What was the culture like of the people living inside of those cities? In other words, what was the culture like? Well, first and foremost, it is very now evident from what we have already covered, is that because those cities were formed by the influx of a multiplicity of different ethnic groups. Some of them are coming from within the United States. There's American farmers, there's African Americans, of course, and there's Europeans. That first and foremost, the culture is going to be very diverse. This is what is called cosmopolitan. Okay, cosmopolitan, again, when we talk about cosmopolitan, is that all of the peoples of the cosmos, all of the peoples of the universe live there. So the culture is that there's many cultures. There's a cultural diversity that makes it very difficult to identify a single unified culture per se, inside of those cities. because what we find is so much diversity. This is so many different groups that have arrived there, coming from many different cultural backgrounds. They have, they're coming, into the city speaking different languages. This is a place where you're going to find, of course, the languages of the world, so to speak. Again, people speaking foreign languages there. Okay, there's different customs of dress, customs of food, for example, religions. There's just so diverse. Okay, so first and foremost, this is one of the cultural features, cultural characteristics, again, of cities, is that, again, they're not a monolith, they're not uniform. You cannot see every body as being part of the same block, because there's so many different cultures there. So first and foremost, at least when we talk about the United States, the experience of the American city in the United States, particularly, now we're not talking about Europe, but American city is extremely diverse. Okay, and this holds true even to this very present day. Okay, when we talk about those large industrial cities in the U.S., again, they're extremely diverse. And one of the reasons, again, is immigration. Okay, melting pot, if you will, of the different cultures of the world coming here. Number two, another cultural feature or characteristic of the new industrial city in the north, particularly in the north, is that there is now a growing trend of urban dwellers, people that dwell in those cities, that are actually in search of identity as well. Well, it is true that some people are trying to preserve their identities, they're trying to preserve their traditions, because they has just recently arrived from a foreign country and all of that. Yeah, well, that is true. There's also the fact that there's other peoples that have arrived to the city, and they're trying to pretty much create or recreate their identities. They wanted to reinvent themselves, in other words. Okay, we're talking about peoples that have arrived there very early on, or they're perhaps second or third generation of immigrants that are not really following the traditions of their parents anymore. They're not really following the norms, the religion, the language of their parents. They have arrived to the city, and because they see so much diversity, what they want to do is pretty much now create something new. In other words, for themselves. They're trying to find themselves inside of this gigantic setting, this gigantic city. And there's so much to choose from, because what you see is just so much diversity in faith, in languages, in food, and customs, that you're trying perhaps to pick, from the cultures that you feel attracted to, and pretty much create your own, in other words, create or recreate, again, a new persona, a new self for yourself. And this is really characteristic of people living in cities, that they're trying to reinvent themselves, they're trying to find themselves, and they're constantly in search for that identity by trying to create an identity through particularly what is called fashion. Okay, fashion. You're trying to dress in a particular way that is going to make you feel secure or cool or attractive or strong or smart, whatever it is. But through fashion, people are trying to reinvent themselves. And if you adopt a certain fashion, okay, and if you have a whole makeover, you try it for a while. If that doesn't work for you, you can always reinvent yourself, by acquiring a whole new different, outlook, a not different dress or a different fashion altogether. Okay, so fashion is going to be part of American culture. Fashion, that is to say, fashion itself, dressing in particular ways or modifying their bodies. There's going to be people trying to comb their hairs in particular ways or put makeups and so on. Now there's more different types of bodily modifications. There's, of course, tattooing. There is, things like what's called, piercing, scarification, and so on and so forth. There's so many things you can do to your body to pretty much project a certain identity, so you can actually tell others who you are, in other words. And now you have, of course, magazines, of course, that actually present samples. There's models that tell you how you can look like, for example, if you dress this way, if you use certain attires, if you comb your hair in this particular fashion or another, so on and so forth. So this is, again, extremely important. Just for understanding people living in cities, is that there's, of course, a great number of people that see fashion as a way of trying to, create or recreate an identity. They're trying to invent themselves, in other words, through fashion. And again, this is something that even today we see that very strongly, again, among people living in cities that call themselves modern. This is part of the living in a modern city, in other words. Okay? And another, of course, issue, another cultural feature of the new industrial city, again, is that the people that lived in those cities back during this time, and even all the way to today, is that, people try to spend some time when they're not working, particularly during the weekends, for example, in what is called leisure pastimes. Okay? Leisure pastimes. They want to actually escape the routine of work, of the week, in activities that are going to provide a sense of relief or relaxation and so on, entertainment, what we call, for example, back in the late 19th century, one of the most popular leisure pastimes of the American city was, again, sports. Again, people attending sports events in terms of baseball, boxing, basketball, and tennis. Again, this was one way to socialize, not only with your friends, your peers, to have a good time, but also socialize with the people living in your own city. This is how people actually created a sense of community. People that go to a sports event to support the local team, for example. Okay, you're with other people that are strangers, all to you. Again, they're all strangers, but you come together as a community in that space called the sports event, in a baseball, for example, or basketball, whatever it is, because you're cheering the team that represents your city. So that helps to create what is called city identity. Okay, because the sports teams were pretty much representing the people living in a particular city, and so people now identify themselves. Let's say you're in New York. If you're attending, a baseball event, you see yourself as a New Yorker. Okay, I'm a New Yorker because I'm cheering, my local team, and all the people that are here, congregated, are also New Yorkers as well. So we see ourselves again as New Yorkers. So we bond again. There's this, this actually helps people actually, create this sense of belongingness, fitting in and creating a sense of community. The same holds true for, of course, national teams that represents an entire country. National sports teams also help bring people together of an entire nation, because they're now supporting the national sports team that is competing with another nation, and so that helps, again, people of a particular country come together as one community, that is to say. So you see yourself as American, in other words, despite the fact that you might live in New York, others might live in Texas, and so on, that we forget about those differences, about those regional differences, because we all come together in support of the same team, that is to say. Okay, so again, this is all I have in terms of the new modern industrial city. This again is the end of part one. I covered pretty much thoroughly the introduction, the table of contents, and of course the development of the very first part of the table of contents, the North and the rise of the new American industrial city, by looking at the second industrial revolution, the new industries that came to the North, and how we're going to see the rise of a whole new social setting called the modern industrial city and how that city was built through migrations, how the foreign immigrants were coping, adapting, assimilating, the strategies they used, the layout of the American city as well, in terms of looking at the ghettos and the ethnic communities and the suburbs, and also looking at the culture itself, what it's called urban culture. Okay, so when we come back in session 2, we're going to look now at the New South, the transformation of this region called the South into a more modern, if you will, society with a modern economy. We're going to look that closely again when we come back in session 2. Thank you.